An early morning in the suburbs began with an unusual silence. Usually, a soft hum of cars could be heard from the highway, and birds outside would engage in their endless chatter. But today, it seemed as if the whole world had frozen, leaving Madison alone with her thoughts. She stood in the kitchen, running her fingers over the cool surface of the granite countertop. Her hand paused when she heard the crackle of the coffee maker, a sound that was usually unnoticeable but seemed deafening this morning. Madison loved this time of day, when the house was just waking up, when she could pretend that life had finally fallen into place just as she had always dreamed. Light from the wide window flooded the room, and its warmth seemed to seep inside her, driving away the remnants of nighttime anxiety. This was the very house she had built over the years, dreaming of tranquility. But tranquility always hid a threat. The threat that too much time for reflection could open old wounds. She took a cup of coffee and turned to the sofa in the living room. On it, curled up, lay Jaden. His chest rose and fell slowly under a thin t-shirt, and his legs, too long for the sofa, hung over the edge. Whenever she looked at him, she felt a strange mix of pride and longing. He was a man, a real adult, but in her eyes, he remained the boy she had hugged at night to chase away his fears. But today, looking at him, she felt something else. Something that shouldn't be there. "Hey, are you going to sleep all day?" She tried to add more playfulness to her voice than she actually felt. Jaden opened one eye, lazily smiled, and stretched. The gesture was so natural that she didn't immediately realize why her gaze lingered on his hands, toned from hours at the gym, or on how his t-shirt slightly rode up, revealing the line of his stomach. It was just a moment. No more. But it pierced her like cold air. He hummed, closing his eyes again. "5 more minutes, Mom. I earned them." "You earned more than 5 minutes," she muttered to herself. But there was more truth in her words than she was willing to admit. Madison turned away, set her mug on the table, and stared out the window. There was something wrong with this morning, as if the world had shifted half a degree and everything was slightly off. She felt a strange excitement. Not anxiety, but rather a spark, quietly smoldering somewhere inside. When she looked back at the sofa, Jaden was already sitting up, running a hand through his tousled hair. "What are we doing today?" he asked, his voice still a bit hoarse from sleep. She didn't answer right away. At that moment, Madison realized what was bothering her. It wasn't the house or her life or her own thoughts. It was him. His gaze a little too attentive, his voice a little too warm, his presence too palpable in the morning silence. "Did you notice how quiet it is?" she asked to hide her thoughts. "I don't know." He shrugged and stood up. His movements were lazy, but there was a confidence in them that she couldn't help but notice. "Maybe silence is a good sign." "Maybe," she repeated, but there was a note of doubt in her voice. That morning, as Jaden walked past her, brushing her shoulder just a bit, she felt something she shouldn't have. She told herself it was just the morning, that it was just her tired mind playing tricks on her. But deep down, Madison already knew that today would be different. Madison stood by the window, looking out at the backyard. The morning fog was barely lifting, shrouding the trees in a thin haze. Her fingers trembled slightly as she held her coffee cup. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was changing, something slippery, barely perceptible, but already here, nearby. Behind her, she heard footsteps. "You're not yourself today." Jaden's voice pulled her from her thoughts. He was already dressed in a gray t-shirt and jeans that hugged his toned body. In his hands, he held an empty mug. "You don't usually stand in one place for so long." Madison turned, noticing the slight smile on his face. His eyes, warm and attentive, lingered on her face a little too long. "Just thinking," she said, looking away. She walked to the coffee maker to refill his mug, feeling his gaze following her. It was a strange feeling. Not what she had experienced before, but the thought immediately flashed through her mind. Too close. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, leaning against the table. His voice was soft, almost like a therapist trying to get you to open up. About us, she answered before she could stop herself. She set his mug on the table, avoiding direct eye contact. About how far we've come, how much we've been through. Jaden snorted and shook his head. Mom, you deserve some quiet and peace. You've worked too hard to make all this possible. He waved his hand, indicating the spacious kitchen, the house that had become their sanctuary. Madison smiled, but it wasn't a smile that reached her eyes. And what about you? Don't you deserve all this too? Deserve? He laughed and took a sip of coffee. You're talking like I've lost something. I like everything. You should too. She looked at him, standing there, confident, calm, yet something in his pose, the way he slightly rocked the mug, betrayed tension. He wasn't as untroubled as he seemed. You don't always say everything you think, do you? She asked suddenly. Her own voice sounded surprisingly serious, even to herself. Jaden froze. His gaze met hers and the air hung heavy with tension, thick as the fog outside. Not always, he finally admitted, lowering his eyes. And you? Madison felt her heart tighten. The moment was almost unbearably intimate. She could answer truthfully or hide behind a light joke again, but something inside her said she couldn't hide today. Not always, she finally replied. Sometimes it's easier to stay silent than to say what you feel. Jaden looked at her as if she had just opened the door to a room he was afraid to see. So say it, he whispered. His voice was low, calm, but there was a challenge in it. She swallowed, feeling her throat go dry. Jaden, sometimes I think that I've lost something important, something I can't get back. He frowned but didn't look away. Are you talking about Dad? Madison turned away, shaking her head. Number not him. I let go of that a long time ago, but... She turned back, meeting his gaze. About you. About how we've become too close for it to feel normal. Those words hung in the air like thunder that just wouldn't break. Jaden looked confused, but not repulsed. He set the mug on the table and took a step closer, his voice almost a whisper. You think that's bad? That we're close? She couldn't answer right away. Her heart was beating too fast for her thoughts to form words. I think, she began, but fell silent when he took another step, closing the distance between them. Now they stood so close that she could feel the warmth of his body. Sometimes closeness is all that's left, he said. His voice sounded like he was talking not just about her, but about himself too. Her fingers nervously traced the edge of the countertop as she looked into his eyes, full of something inexplicable yet pulling. She felt time slow down and her breath with it. Jaden, we need to be careful, she said, breaking the moment. Her voice trembled, but she couldn't keep her eyes off his face. Why? His question was simple, almost childlike, but it held a challenge. Because... She looked away, trying to find the right words. Sometimes boundaries are needed to protect us from ourselves. He paused for a second, as if digesting her words, then took a step back and nodded. You're right, he said, his voice strangely soft. But sometimes I feel like we've already crossed that boundary. Madison stood still, looking at him, unable to say anything. When he turned and left the kitchen, she felt a strange emptiness. She wanted to take it all back, but at the same time, she felt that something had irrevocably shifted. She stood by the window for a long time, watching as the sun rose higher, dispelling the remnants of the fog. But inside her, something remained just as thick and mysterious as the morning that had started it all. By evening, Madison's house was filled with sounds. The hum of the TV, the soft crackle of a candle on the kitchen table where she sat with her laptop. But her thoughts were elsewhere. She tried to focus on work, but instead, her gaze wandered to the living room where Jaden lay on the sofa, engrossed in his phone. His body was stretched out along the armrest, and his t-shirt had ridden up again, revealing a strip of skin on his stomach. Are you just going to lie around all day? Or will you actually do something today? She joked, trying to ease the tension she felt herself. Jaden didn't look up from his phone, but the corners of his mouth lifted in a faint smile. That would be disappointing if you hadn't said it with such sarcasm. Sarcasm is my second language, she replied, getting up from the table and opening the fridge. Inside were leftovers from last night's dinner, some fruit, and a bottle of white wine. She considered pouring herself a glass but stopped, feeling her hand already reaching for the bottle. Today was not the day to make things worse. Have you always been like this? He suddenly asked, making her turn around. He was looking at her, his phone resting on his chest, his eyes shining with a strange curiosity. Like what? She asked, taking out an apple and biting into it. Someone who keeps everything under control, even when you clearly don't want to, he replied, propping himself up on his elbows. There was no mockery or accusation in his voice, only straightforwardness that made her throat go dry. Someone has to, she said after a pause. Her voice sounded softer than she expected. Maybe not always. He shrugged. Sometimes you can just let yourself relax. Madison looked at him, studying him. There was something else in his tone, something he wasn't saying, and it made her feel vulnerable. She closed the fridge and sat back down at the table, trying to distract herself from his words. But his gaze was palpable, like the heat from the candle that was getting too close. You don't want to just sit at home all evening? He finally said, breaking the silence. His voice was surprisingly casual. If you're trying to drag me to the gym, you can forget it right now. She smirked, but her smile was strained. Not the gym. He smiled again, but this time there was something new in his smile. I was thinking, maybe the hot tub? You seemed to enjoy it last time. Madison froze. Her heart skipped a beat before she forced herself to speak. You said it wasn't your thing, she replied, looking at her laptop screen, though she couldn't see a single word on it. Change my mind, he said lightly, getting up from the sofa. Now is the perfect time. Warm water, evening. Perfect. She looked at him, trying to gauge if he was serious, but he was already heading towards the stairs. Are you coming? He asked, looking back over his shoulder. There was that slight challenge in his eyes again, which she couldn't ignore. Madison sighed, leaving her laptop and following him. She told herself it was just a moment, like the last time. She wouldn't let it go too far. But her inner voice wasn't as convincing as she hoped. Outside it was cool, but the water in the hot tub felt too hot as she dipped her feet in. She wore a black bikini, modest but stylish enough to make her feel confident. She watched as Jaden slipped into the water across from her, settling in so he could look directly into her eyes. So, how do you like it? She asked, trying to sound casual. Definitely worth it, he said, leaning back. His face relaxed, but there was still a spark in his eyes that she couldn't miss. For a few minutes, they sat in silence, enjoying the warmth of the water and the soft rustle of the wind. But the tension between them became almost tangible. Are you always this confident? She suddenly asked, breaking the silence. Her voice was steady, but inside she was trembling. Confident? He raised an eyebrow, smiling. Number, but around you, I feel different. She frowned, trying to understand what he meant. Different how? Like I can be myself, without filters. His words were simple, but there was something in them that made her heart ache. Madison looked away, feeling her cheeks flush. She tried to think of a response, but the words seemed stuck in her throat. You know I'll always be here, right? He said, suddenly sitting up straight. His voice was serious, his gaze insistent. I know, she whispered, still not looking at him. But those words didn't feel honest enough. She knew that between them something was growing that she couldn't understand and couldn't control. Good, he said, leaning back again. But the tension didn't dissipate. It hung in the air, thick as fog, enveloping them from head to toe. Madison knew they were playing with fire, but stopping was no longer possible. Evening turned into night, and the house was shrouded in semi-darkness. The hot tub had long since cooled, but its warmth still lingered in Madison's body. She sat on the edge of her bed, wrapped in a towel, looking out the window where the faint moonlight illuminated the yard. Her thoughts swirled around Jaden and their strange, inexplicable conversation. Everything she had tried to suppress within herself was now bursting out, making her feel vulnerable, as if stripped bare, not physically, but emotionally. A knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. "Mom?" Jaden called softly from outside. His voice was quiet, almost uncertain. She took a deep breath, trying to keep her voice steady. "Come in." The door opened and he stepped inside. He was wearing only athletic shorts, his hair still wet from the shower. She noticed the droplets of water glistening on his collarbones. He looked nothing like the little boy she used to hug in the night to chase away his nightmares. Before her stood a grown man, and this realization hit her nerves like thunder from a clear sky. "I wanted to talk," he said, coming closer. "About what?" Her voice sounded softer than she intended. Jaden sat on the edge of the bed, a little closer than she would have liked. She felt his warmth and noticed the tension in his hands resting on his knees. "About us?" he said, looking straight at her. His eyes were insistent, but there was still something uncertain in them. "Jaden." She looked away, feeling her heart start to race. "Everything is fine between us. There's nothing to worry about." "No, not like that." He shook his head. "I'm not talking about how you see it. I'm talking about how I feel." She froze. Those words, simple and direct, tore through the silence like a clap of thunder. She didn't know what to say. Everything she feared was now standing before her, embodied in words. "You feel?" she finally asked, her voice trembling. "Something I shouldn't be feeling," he confessed, his gaze sliding over her face, pausing at her eyes. "And I know you feel it too." Madison stood up as if trying to escape his words. She went to the window, looking at the moonlight, as if it could give her answers. "You don't understand what you're saying," she said, folding her arms across her chest. "I understand more than you think." His voice was firm. "And I know we need to talk about this instead of pretending." She turned to him, feeling her defenses crumbling. "Pretending? Pretending that I'm your mother and I shouldn't even be thinking about what you're talking about? Pretending that this is wrong?" "Do you really think it's wrong?" he asked, standing up. His height, his confidence. It all suddenly felt overwhelming, yet also drawing her in. She looked at him, unable to answer. This was more than just a question. It was a test, a challenge she didn't know how to face. "You're my mother, yes," he continued, taking a step closer. "But we're more than just mother and son. We've always been closer than others. And I don't know when that changed, but I feel it too." Her feet felt rooted to the spot. He stood so close, his face illuminated by the soft moonlight, making him look even more like a man, not a child. "Jaden, we can't," she began, but her voice faltered and she couldn't finish. "Why?" he asked, his voice quiet but insistent. "Because it's wrong? Or because you're afraid you'll feel the same way I do?" She felt the air grow thick, as if the whole world was shrinking to this moment, to this room. Her heart pounded, as if trying to escape her chest. She swallowed, her voice breaking. "I just don't know how to handle this." "You're not alone." His voice was almost a whisper, but it held a certainty that made her trembling subside. "We'll handle it. Together." He reached out, his hand touching her shoulder. The gesture was both soothing and igniting something within her. She wanted to push him away, but she couldn't. Instead, she froze, feeling her defenses crumble completely. "Jaden, this is complicated," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Sometimes complicated is good," he replied, his hand sliding down, lightly but noticeably. She couldn't respond. Everything she felt, everything she wanted to say was stuck deep inside, like a storm about to burst. She knew they both stood on the edge of something uncharted, dangerous, yet alluring. And in that night, under the soft moonlight, the silence between them said more than words ever could. Night was dark, the silence of the house broken only by the faint whisper of the wind outside. Madison sat on the sofa in the living room, wrapped in a blanket, a cup of tea in her hands. Her thoughts were heavy, like stones. She tried to focus on the movie playing on the screen, but nothing reached her consciousness. All her attention was on the words Jaden had said in her bedroom a few hours earlier. "You're not alone." Those words, quiet but filled with certainty, stuck in her head. She felt them shaking the walls she had built around herself for years. They were so simple, yet they held a truth she was afraid to admit. She wasn't alone. Never had been. Jaden was there. Always. But now that closeness took on a completely different meaning. She sighed and took a sip of tea when she heard him coming down the stairs. The steps were unhurried, confident, yet too loud in the night silence. She didn't look up, though her heart started to race. "You're still up?" he asked, appearing in the doorway. "Can't sleep," she replied, trying to sound calm, though her voice was softer than usual. He came closer, leaning against the back of the chair. His hair was slightly tousled, as if he had just gotten out of bed, but his eyes were clear, as if he hadn't slept either. "You can't sleep either," she noted, looking away. "Can't?" He repeated her words, and there was a strange softness in his voice. Madison set her cup aside and turned to him. He stood so close that she could see every detail of his face. The light from the TV made his features sharper, highlighting his high cheekbones and strong jawline. This was not the boy she had raised, but a man, and that realization hit her nerves anew. "Did you want to say something?" she finally asked, breaking the silence. "I did." He paused as if choosing his words. "I wanted to ask how you're feeling, after that conversation." Her lips parted slightly, but she didn't know what to say. How could she explain to him what was going on inside her? That chaos, that desire mixed with guilt and fear? "I'm not sure," she finally admitted. "And you? Me?" He smiled faintly, but there was no lightness in his smile. "I'm not sure either, but one thing I know for sure. We can't ignore this anymore." "Jaden," her voice sounded almost pleading. "We have to. It's wrong. It's wrong, you understand?" He looked up at her, and in his gaze there was something that made her heart ache. "You think it's wrong because that's what they say? Or wrong because that's how you feel?" Her breath caught. She knew he wasn't going to back down. His gaze was direct, almost demanding, and she couldn't look away. "I don't know," she whispered, feeling a hollow emptiness growing inside her. "I'm confused." "Then let me make it clear," he said, taking a step closer. His voice was low, but there was insistence in it. "I know this isn't just for you. It's not just for us. But I feel it. Every time I'm near you. It's impossible to ignore." Madison closed her eyes, her hands clutching the edge of the blanket. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think. Everything within her screamed to stop, but she couldn't find the strength to do it. "Do you understand what you're saying?" she finally asked, opening her eyes. There was more fear than reproach in her gaze. "I understand." His voice was firm. "And I know you feel it too." She wanted to argue, to say he was wrong, but the words stuck in her throat. She saw in his eyes something she couldn't ignore. It was more than just desire. It was deeper. "Jaden, we can't—" she began, but he interrupted her. "Why? Give me one reason why we can't be honest with each other," he said, taking her hand. His fingers were warm, enveloping. "Why are you afraid of this?" "Because it could ruin everything," she whispered, her voice trembling. "You're all I have. If we cross that line—" "It won't ruin us," he said, his voice even softer but all the more convincing. I will never let you go. Never. Her heart was pounding so hard she could feel the blood pulsing in her temples. She looked at him, her eyes filled with tears, but she couldn't look away. I'm scared, she finally admitted. I'm scared of what I feel. Don't be scared. His voice was almost a whisper, but it held a certainty that made her trembling subside. Let me show you it's not scary. He leaned in slowly, and she felt his breath on her skin. She knew this wasn't just another moment. It was a point of no return. But instead of pulling back, she closed her eyes and let the moment happen. Morning was clear and cold. The winter sun filtered through the curtains, casting a soft, almost soothing light into the room. But inside Madison, everything was different. She sat on the bed, hugging her knees, staring at a single spot on the floor. Her head was filled with memories of the previous night, which she tried to push away, but they wouldn't leave her alone. Let me show you it's not scary. Jaden's words, his voice, his confidence, it all came back to her in a wave, leaving her drained. She couldn't believe she had let it happen, that she had crossed a line she had sworn never to cross. The door creaked open, and Jaden appeared in the doorway. He was dressed in a t-shirt and sweatpants, his hair still tousled, but his face serious. He stopped when he saw her, and for a moment silence hung between them. Are you okay? His voice was soft, but there was caution in it. No, she replied, not looking up. Her voice was hoarse, almost a whisper. I'm not okay, Jaden. This was all a mistake. His face twitched slightly, but he didn't look away. He closed the door behind him and came closer, but stopped at a safe distance. Why do you think that? He asked, his voice calm, but his eyes held pain. She looked up at him, her eyes filled with tears. Because this is destroying us, destroying what we've built over the years. It's wrong, and you know it. Mom, he began, but she raised her hand, stopping him. You don't understand. Her voice broke. I can't let this continue. I can't let myself lose you. You won't lose me, he said, taking a step closer. Never. What happened doesn't change who we are to each other. It only proves how important we are to each other. No, Jaden, she said sharply, standing up. Her hands were trembling. It doesn't. It doesn't make us closer. It puts us on the edge of something we can't come back from. He froze, looking at her with an expression that broke her heart. He was trying to understand her, trying to find the words to comfort her, but he couldn't. You think I wanted to hurt you? His voice was quiet, almost desperate. Do you think I don't know how hard this is for you? For both of us? This isn't about pain, she replied, turning away to the window. Her voice was firmer than she expected. This is about what's right and what's wrong, and we both know where that line is. The line? He repeated, bitterly smiling. And who decides where it is? People who have never lived our lives? Who don't know what it's like to be as close as we are? Her breath caught. She knew he was right, that their bond had always been deeper than others. But she also knew it wasn't an excuse. We need to stop, she said, finally turning back to him. Her face was resolute, but her eyes betrayed her inner struggle. If we don't stop now, this will destroy us. You know that too. He was silent, his gaze darkened, but he didn't argue. He knew she was right. Deep down, he had always known. But that didn't make the moment any easier. What now? He asked, his voice hollow. We keep living, she replied, trying to keep her voice from trembling. You go back to your life. I go back to mine. We need to forget about this. Forget? He looked up at her, and in his gaze, there was something that made her heart ache. Do you think that's possible? We have to try, she said, clenching her fists to hold back the trembling. It's the only way to save us. He nodded, lowering his head. Her words were the truth, and he knew it. but that didn't make it any easier. He slowly walked to the door but stopped before leaving. "I don't regret it," he said softly, but his words rang louder than they should have. "Not 1 second." And with those words, he left, leaving her alone in the room where the air felt too heavy to breathe. Madison remained by the window for a long time, watching as the sun rose higher, dispelling the remnants of the fog. But inside her, something remained just as thick and mysterious as the morning that had started it all. She knew she had made the right choice. It was the only choice she could make. Sometimes, she thought, loving someone means knowing when to let go. And though this feeling wouldn't disappear, she had to find the strength to live on. For herself, for Jaden, and for the future they deserved. Even if not together. She sighed, closing her eyes, and for what felt like the first time in a long while, she felt a quiet, yet painful emptiness.